Sarah Martinez never imagined her Tuesday evening would end in flames. She was a social worker in Detroit, spending her days helping families stay together. Her small apartment on Maple Street was her sanctuary after long shifts at the community center. That night she came home exhausted, carrying groceries and thinking about the single mother she had helped earlier that day. The building was quiet as usual. Mrs. Chen from apartment 2B was cooking something that smelled like ginger. The hallway lights flickered as they always did. Sarah climbed the stairs to the third floor, her keys jangling in her hand. She had no idea that someone had been watching her for weeks. Marcus Webb lived in the shadows of society. He had a criminal record longer than most people's grocery lists. Drug charges, assault, robbery. His life was a series of bad choices that kept getting worse. 3 months ago, Sarah had testified in court about his treatment of his girlfriend and their 2 children. Because of her testimony, Marcus lost custody. His girlfriend left him. His anger grew like a disease, feeding on itself until it became something darker. He blamed Sarah for everything. In his twisted mind, she had destroyed his life. He spent weeks following her, learning her routine, planning his revenge. He knew she came home around 7 every Tuesday. He knew she lived alone. He knew exactly how to hurt her. Sarah unlocked her door and stepped inside. She set her groceries on the kitchen counter and kicked off her shoes. The apartment was warm and welcoming with photos of her family on the walls. Her younger sister had just gotten engaged. Her parents were planning to visit next month. Life felt good despite the challenges of her job. She didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway. She didn't notice her door hadn't fully latched. Marcus had been waiting in the stairwell, watching through the small window. When he saw her light turn on, he made his move. The door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Sarah spun around, her heart jumping into her throat. Marcus stood in the doorway and she recognized him immediately. His eyes were wild, unfocused. In his hands, he carried 2 gasoline containers. Sarah's training kicked in. She knew about de-escalation, about staying calm in crisis situations. But this was different. This was personal hatred staring at her with cold determination. Marcus didn't say much. He didn't need to. He splashed gasoline across her living room floor, across her couch, across the walls where her family photos hung. The chemical smell was overwhelming, burning her nose and throat. Sarah backed toward her bedroom, her phone in her pocket, trying to reach it without making sudden movements. He saw her hand move and laughed. It was a horrible sound, empty of any human warmth. He splashed more gasoline, creating a trail from the living room to where she stood. Sarah's mind raced through options. The window was too high to jump. The door was blocked. Her neighbors were elderly or at work. Marcus pulled out a lighter. The small flame danced in the dim light of her apartment. Sarah's whole body went cold despite the summer heat. She thought of her family, of the children she had helped, of all the things she still wanted to do with her life. He didn't give any warning. He simply dropped the lighter onto the gasoline-soaked carpet. The flames erupted instantly, racing across the floor like a living thing. The fire roared to life with a sound that seemed to shake the walls. Heat blasted across Sarah's face, singeing her hair. Marcus ran. He disappeared down the hallway as smoke began filling the apartment. Sarah screamed and tried to reach the door, but the flames had already created a wall of fire between her and escape. The smoke was thick and black, making it impossible to see or breathe. She dropped to the floor where the air was slightly clearer. Her apartment became an inferno in seconds. The fire consumed her furniture, her books, her memories. The heat was unbearable. Sarah crawled toward her bedroom window, coughing violently, her lungs burning. She could hear shouting from outside, people screaming about fire, someone yelling to call 911. She reached the window and tried to open it, but the old latch was stuck. Panic took over. She grabbed a chair and smashed the glass, cutting her hands. Smoke poured out the broken window. She could see people gathering below, 3 floors down. Too far to jump. Too far to survive. The fire was behind her now, eating through her bedroom door. The heat was so intense her skin felt like it was cooking. She hung halfway out the window, gasping for air, trying to stay conscious. Black smoke surrounded her like a toxic cloud. Down on the street, neighbors watched in horror. Mrs. Chen was crying, calling Sarah's name. Someone had already called 911, but everyone knew the fire trucks wouldn't arrive in time. The flames were too fast, too hungry. That's when a pickup truck came around the corner, driving faster than it should have on a residential street. It screeched to a stop in front of the burning building. A man jumped out, tall and muscular, with close-cropped hair and a scar across his left cheek. He looked up at Sarah hanging from the window, assessed the situation in seconds, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. His name was James Cooper, and he was a Navy SEAL home on leave. He had seen combat in 3 different countries, had been trained to run toward danger when everyone else ran away. But even his training hadn't prepared him for what he was about to do. James Cooper had been driving through the neighborhood when he saw smoke rising above the buildings. His instincts took over immediately. Years of training had taught him to recognize danger and respond without hesitation. He turned the corner and saw the apartment building engulfed in flames on the 3rd floor. People were gathered on the sidewalk, pointing and screaming. He spotted Sarah hanging from the window, her clothes already starting to smoke. Most people would have waited for firefighters. Most people would have said there was nothing they could do. James wasn't most people. He had pulled teammates from burning vehicles in Afghanistan. He had dragged wounded soldiers through buildings under fire. He understood something that few others did. Sometimes you have to move before you have time to think. He ran to his truck bed and grabbed his gym bag. Inside was a heavy blanket he kept for emergencies. It wasn't fireproof, but it was thick. He soaked it with 2 bottles of water he had in his truck. The neighbors watched him like he was crazy. Mrs. Chen grabbed his arm and said the fire department was coming, that he needed to wait. James looked her in the eye and said something he had told countless people during his military career. Waiting wasn't always an option. Sometimes the difference between life and death was measured in seconds, not minutes. He pulled his arm free gently and turned toward the building entrance. The front door was already hot to the touch. Smoke was pouring through the gaps around the frame. James wrapped the wet blanket around his shoulders and head, covering as much of his body as possible. He took 3 deep breaths, filling his lungs with clean air, then pulled open the door. The heat hit him like a physical force. The stairwell was filled with smoke so thick he could barely see his own hands. The fire hadn't reached the stairs yet, but it was close. He could hear it roaring above him, consuming everything in its path. The sound was deafening, like standing next to a jet engine. James kept low and moved fast. His training kicked in completely now. In combat, you learn to operate in conditions that would paralyze normal people. You learn to push through fear and pain and keep moving toward your objective. His objective was simple: reach the 3rd floor and get that woman out. The stairs felt endless. Each step took him deeper into the smoke and heat. His eyes burned and watered. The wet blanket was already starting to steam. By the time he reached the 2nd floor landing, he could feel the moisture evaporating from the fabric. The building groaned around him, wood and metal expanding from the intense heat. Sarah was fading. The smoke inhalation was taking its toll. Her grip on the window frame was weakening. She could hear sirens in the distance, but they sounded so far away. Her vision was tunneling, everything going gray at the edges. She tried to hold on, tried to stay conscious, but her body was shutting down to protect itself. James reached the 3rd floor and the hallway was hell. Flames covered the ceiling and walls. Sarah's apartment door was gone, consumed by fire. The carpet was melting, sticking to his boots as he moved. The heat was so intense that he could feel his skin blistering even through his clothes. The wet blanket was smoking now, beginning to char. He had maybe 30 seconds before the blanket caught fire, maybe less. His throat was raw from the smoke. Every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. But he kept moving forward because stopping meant dying, and dying meant that woman in the window died too. He reached Sarah's apartment and the interior was completely engulfed. The fire had spread from the living room through the entire space. He could see the bedroom doorway across a sea of flames. There was no clear path, no safe route. There was only fire and smoke and heat that made the air shimmer like summer pavement. James did something that would later be analyzed by fire safety experts and military psychologists. He charged straight through. He pulled the blanket tighter around his body and ran directly into the flames. The fire consumed the blanket immediately. He felt it burning through to his skin. The pain was extraordinary, unlike anything he had experienced even in combat. But he didn't stop. 3 steps through the flames felt like 3 miles. His boots were melting. His hair was singed. The skin on his arms blistered and burst. But his momentum carried him through to the bedroom doorway. He crashed through, rolled to smother any flames on his body, and came up running toward the window. Sarah had collapsed. She was hanging halfway out the window, unconscious, held only by her hips caught on the window frame. James reached her just as her body started to slip. He grabbed her around the waist and pulled her back inside, away from the 3-story drop. Now came the harder part. Getting out. The path he had taken was fully engulfed now. The bedroom was filling with smoke. The floor beneath them was hot enough to burn through his boots. He looked around frantically for another option, any option. The window. It was the only way. But 3 stories was too high to jump. They would both die from the fall. Unless there was something to break their landing. James looked down and saw that more neighbors had gathered. Someone had grabbed mattresses from inside the building. They were dragging them into position below the window. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't safe. But it was their only chance. James lifted Sarah's unconscious body and positioned her in his arms. She was small, maybe 5'4", and light enough that he could control their fall. He climbed onto the windowsill, feeling the frame burning through his pants. The crowd below was screaming at him. Some were yelling to wait for the fire department. Others were positioning the mattresses, trying to create the largest landing area possible. James didn't have time to wait. He could feel the floor beneath the window starting to give way. The entire apartment was about to collapse. He jumped. For a moment, they were suspended in air, falling through smoke and heat and the screams of spectators. James twisted his body in midair, positioning himself beneath Sarah so he would take the impact first. It was instinct more than thought. The same instinct that had saved his teammates in combat dozens of times. They hit the mattresses hard. The impact drove the air from James's lungs and sent pain shooting through his already injured body. But the mattresses did their job. They absorbed enough of the fall that neither Sarah nor James broke any major bones. James rolled with Sarah still in his arms, getting them both away from the building. Above them, the apartment exploded. The fire had reached something flammable, maybe a gas line or stored chemicals. The explosion blew out the remaining windows and sent debris raining down on the street. If they had waited even 10 more seconds, they would have been killed by the blast. Emergency vehicles were arriving now. Fire trucks, ambulances, police cars. Paramedics rushed forward and took Sarah from James's arms. She wasn't breathing properly. They started working on her immediately, clearing her airway, administering oxygen. James tried to stand and collapsed. The adrenaline that had kept him moving was fading, and his body was reporting all the damage he had ignored. The paramedics surrounded James immediately. His skin was covered in 2nd and 3rd degree burns across his arms, back, and legs. His lungs were damaged from smoke inhalation. His face was blackened with soot and his hair was singed down to the scalp in several places. But he was conscious and fighting the paramedics, trying to see if Sarah was alive. They loaded both of them into separate ambulances. Sarah still wasn't breathing on her own. The paramedics had intubated her, forcing air into her damaged lungs. Her chances of survival were uncertain at best. The amount of smoke she had inhaled would have killed most people already. Her body temperature was dangerously high from the heat exposure. Her skin showed signs of severe burns on her arms and face. James was in the other ambulance, finally allowing the paramedics to work on him. The pain was hitting him now in waves that made him dizzy. Every movement of his body sent fire through his nervous system. The paramedics were cutting away his burned clothing, revealing the extent of his injuries. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, told him he was incredibly lucky to be alive. James laughed, then coughed violently. Luck had nothing to do with it. Training and determination had kept him alive. Luck was for people who waited for rescue. At the hospital, they were rushed into separate emergency rooms. Sarah's condition was critical. The doctors worked frantically to stabilize her. Her oxygen levels were dangerously low. Her airway was swollen from the heat and smoke. They had to make quick decisions about treatment that would determine whether she lived or died. Dr. Patricia Mills was the lead physician on Sarah's case. She had 20 years of experience treating burn victims and trauma patients. She had seen people die from injuries less severe than Sarah's. But she had also seen miracles happen when patients refused to give up. As she worked to save Sarah's life, she kept thinking about the man who had run through fire to rescue her. That kind of courage deserved to be rewarded with success. James was in surgery having his burns cleaned and treated. The procedure was excruciating even with anesthesia. Burned skin had to be removed. His wounds had to be thoroughly cleaned to prevent infection. The doctors were amazed he had maintained consciousness as long as he did. Most people would have gone into shock from the pain alone. While they were both in surgery, police were at the scene investigating. They had caught Marcus Webb trying to flee the neighborhood. Several witnesses had seen him running from the building right after the fire started. Mrs. Chen had given a detailed description. The police found gasoline on his clothes and hands. He had been so focused on escaping that he didn't think to wash up or change clothes. Detective Raymond Torres was assigned to the case. He was a veteran investigator with a reputation for being thorough and relentless. When he interviewed Marcus Webb, the man's guilt was obvious. He was nervous, contradicting himself, unable to maintain eye contact. But it was the security camera footage from a nearby convenience store that sealed his fate. The footage showed Marcus purchasing the gasoline cans 2 hours before the fire. It showed him carrying them toward Sarah's building. Marcus tried to claim it was an accident. He said he was just trying to scare Sarah, not kill her. Detective Torres had heard every excuse in the book during his career. This was attempted murder, plain and simple. The evidence was overwhelming. Marcus Webb would be spending the next few decades in prison if Sarah survived. If she died, he would face murder charges. Sarah remained unconscious for 3 days. Her family arrived from California, scared and desperate for good news. Her mother sat by her bedside day and night, holding her hand and praying. Her father paced the hallways, unable to sit still, tormented by the thought of losing his daughter. Her sister brought photos from their childhood, talking to Sarah's unconscious form about memories they shared. James was in a room down the hall, recovering from his own injuries. His burns were serious but not life-threatening. The bigger concern was infection. Burn wounds were notorious for becoming infected. An infection could kill him as surely as the fire itself. He was on heavy antibiotics and pain medication. His military training had taught him to handle pain, but this was testing even his considerable tolerance. On the 4th day, Sarah woke up. Her mother was dozing in the chair beside the bed when Sarah's eyes fluttered open. Her throat was raw from the breathing tube. She couldn't speak at first, could barely move. But she was alive and conscious, and that was everything. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. Sarah had survived the most dangerous period. Her lungs were healing, though she would likely have permanent damage. Her burns would scar but weren't as extensive as they could have been. The fact that James had gotten her out so quickly had saved her from much worse injuries. When Sarah could finally speak, her first question was about the man who saved her. The nurses told her about James, about how he had run through fire to reach her, about his own injuries. Sarah started crying, overwhelmed by gratitude and emotion. A stranger had risked his life for her. A complete stranger had walked through hell itself to pull her from the flames. James heard that Sarah was awake and insisted on visiting her, despite his doctor's orders to stay in bed. He made it halfway down the hall before a nurse caught him and made him use a wheelchair. His burns were still too fresh for him to be walking around. But James was stubborn, a trait that had served him well in the military and in life. When Sarah saw James wheeled into her room, she broke down completely. This man, covered in bandages with visible burn scars on his face and arms, had saved her life. She tried to thank him but couldn't get the words out through her tears. James smiled, which must have hurt given his facial burns, and told her she didn't need to thank him. It was just what you did. You helped people who needed help. They talked for a while, as much as Sarah's damaged throat would allow. She learned that James was a Navy SEAL home on leave visiting his sister who lived in Detroit. He was supposed to fly back to his base in California in 3 days, but his injuries would delay that significantly. His commanding officer had already called to check on him and tell him to take whatever time he needed to recover. Sarah learned that James had been in the military for 12 years. He had served multiple tours overseas. He had medals for valor that he kept in a drawer and never looked at. He was humble about his service and his heroism, treating it all like it was just part of the job. Sarah found this attitude both admirable and frustrating. The man had saved her life and acted like it was no big deal. James learned that Sarah was a social worker who dedicated her life to helping vulnerable families. She told him about Marcus Webb, about the case that had led to this attempted murder. James listened quietly, his expression unreadable. He had seen enough evil in the world to not be surprised by what people were capable of doing. But hearing about the systematic abuse that Sarah had tried to stop made him angry in a way few things did. Over the next 2 weeks, as they both recovered in the hospital, James and Sarah developed an unlikely friendship. He would wheel himself to her room every day and they would talk for hours. She told him about growing up in California, about her dreams of making a real difference in people's lives. He told her about his military career, about the brothers he had lost in combat, about the weight of those memories. The media got hold of the story within days of the fire. A Navy SEAL running through flames to save a social worker made for compelling headlines. News crews camped outside the hospital wanting interviews. The story went viral on social media, with millions of people sharing it and calling James a hero. Local news, then national news, then international outlets picked up the story. James hated the attention. He refused all interview requests. He told the hospital staff to turn away any reporters who tried to visit. He hadn't saved Sarah for recognition or praise. He had done it because someone needed help and he was there. The idea of capitalizing on that or using it for attention made him genuinely uncomfortable. Sarah felt differently. She wanted people to know what James had done, wanted him to receive recognition for his courage. But she respected his wishes and also declined most interview requests. She did agree to one interview with a local news station, mainly to thank the community for their support and to share her story as a warning about domestic violence. During that interview, Sarah spoke about Marcus Webb's history of abuse. She talked about the importance of supporting victims and holding abusers accountable. She explained how her testimony had been part of her job, part of protecting children from harm. She made it clear that social workers and others who intervened in abuse cases sometimes faced retaliation. The system needed better protection for those who stood up for victims. The interview resonated with people across the country. Domestic violence advocates reached out to Sarah with messages of support. Other social workers shared their own stories of being threatened or attacked for doing their jobs. The case became about more than just one attempted murder. It became a conversation about safety for social workers and consequences for abusers. Marcus Webb's trial was scheduled for 6 months later. The prosecutor, Jennifer Lawson, had an airtight case. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage, witness testimony, physical evidence, and Marcus's own contradictory statements all pointed to premeditated attempted murder. He would almost certainly spend 20 to 30 years in prison, but the trial itself would be difficult for Sarah. She would have to face Marcus Webb in court, would have to relive the trauma of that night. Her therapist was helping her prepare, teaching her coping strategies for managing the anxiety and fear. Sarah was determined to testify, to make sure Marcus was held accountable. But she wasn't sure she could do it alone. James offered to be there. His leave had been extended indefinitely due to his injuries. The Navy was supportive, treating his recovery as a priority. His commanding officer had personally called to tell him the Navy was proud of him and to take whatever time he needed. James was using that time to heal and to support Sarah through her recovery. They had become close friends during their time in the hospital. After they were both discharged, James started visiting Sarah at her sister's house where she was staying. Her apartment was destroyed. Everything she owned turned to ash and smoke damage. Insurance would eventually cover a new place. But for now, she was relying on family. James's sister, Rebecca, lived 20 minutes away and had insisted he stay with her during his recovery. Rebecca was a nurse and could help monitor his healing. She also kept trying to set James up on dates, convinced that her brother needed someone in his life. James always deflected these attempts, focusing instead on his recovery and on checking in on Sarah. Sarah was struggling more than she let on. The physical injuries were healing, but the psychological trauma was deeper and more persistent. She had nightmares about the fire almost every night. She woke up screaming, smelling smoke that wasn't there, feeling heat that was only in her memory. Loud noises made her jump. She couldn't be in closed spaces without panic rising in her chest. Her therapist diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress disorder, which wasn't surprising given what she had been through. Treatment would take time. Healing from trauma always did. Sarah threw herself into therapy with the same dedication she had given to her social work. She was determined not to let Marcus Webb destroy her life even if he had destroyed her home. James understood what she was going through better than most people could. He had his own experience with PTSD from combat. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, The way certain sounds or smells could trigger a panic response. He shared his own coping strategies with Sarah, the techniques that had helped him manage his symptoms. They became each other's support system in a way that surprised them both. 4 months after the fire, Sarah returned to work part-time. Her supervisor had held her position and welcomed her back with genuine warmth. But Sarah found the work harder now. Every case involving domestic violence triggered memories of Marcus Webb. Every time she had to testify in court, she felt the old fear rising. She pushed through it, but it took a toll. James was cleared to return to active duty, but he was considering retirement. 12 years in the military was a long career for a Navy SEAL. The physical demands were intense, and his burn injuries had added complications. He could continue serving if he wanted to, but he was thinking about what came next. He had saved money, had skills that translated to civilian work. He was ready for a change. What he wasn't ready for was the realization that he had fallen in love with Sarah. It had happened gradually, so slowly that he didn't notice until it was undeniable. Her strength in the face of trauma impressed him. Her dedication to helping others despite what it had cost her moved him. Her laugh, which had started to return as she healed, made him smile in a way nothing else did. But James didn't say anything. Sarah was recovering from trauma. She didn't need the complication of romantic feelings from the man who had saved her. He convinced himself that what he felt was just protective instinct, just friendship, just gratitude for having been able to save her life. He was very good at lying to himself when he needed to be. Sarah was having similar thoughts. She found herself thinking about James constantly. The way he listened when she talked, really listened with his full attention. The way he understood her struggles without her having to explain. The way his presence made her feel safe in a world that had become frightening. She told herself it was just gratitude, just trauma bonding, just her mind trying to make sense of what they had been through together. The trial date arrived in late November. The weather had turned cold, snow threatening in gray clouds overhead. Sarah dressed carefully that morning, choosing clothes that made her feel professional and strong. Her sister drove her to the courthouse. James met them there, having insisted on coming for support. The courthouse was busy with the usual chaos of the legal system. Lawyers hurried past with briefcases. Defendants in handcuffs were led through hallways. Families of victims and accused sat on benches waiting for their cases to be called. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the noise and activity. Her anxiety was spiking despite the medication her doctor had prescribed. James stayed close to her, a steady presence in the chaos. He didn't say much, didn't try to offer empty reassurances. He just stayed near, letting her know she wasn't alone. It helped more than he probably realized. Marcus Webb was brought into the courtroom in chains. He looked different than Sarah remembered. Smaller somehow, less threatening without his freedom and the element of surprise. But seeing him still triggered a visceral response in Sarah. Her heart raced, her palms sweated. She gripped the wooden bench so hard her knuckles turned white. The prosecutor presented the case methodically, security footage showing Marcus buying gasoline, witness testimony from Mrs. Chen and others who saw him flee, fire investigator reports confirming arson, medical records detailing Sarah's injuries. The case was devastating in its thoroughness. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, she walked to the witness stand on shaking legs. The prosecutor asked her to describe what happened that night. Sarah took a breath and began talking. Her voice was steady despite the fear. She described coming home from work, hearing her door burst open, seeing Marcus with the gasoline containers. She described watching him pour accelerant throughout her apartment, seeing him drop the lighter, watching the flames erupt. Marcus Webb's defense attorney tried to paint his client as a man who had simply lost control, who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of anger. He suggested that Marcus had only meant to scare Sarah, not actually kill her. It was a weak defense and everyone in the courtroom knew it. You don't pour gasoline throughout someone's apartment and light it on fire if you just want to scare them. The prosecutor tore apart this defense methodically. She presented Marcus's history of violence, his pattern of abuse, his threats against Sarah after losing custody of his children. She showed text messages Marcus had sent to friends, saying Sarah would pay for what she did, and that he would make her suffer. These weren't the words of someone who just wanted to have a conversation or issue a warning. James was called to testify about the rescue. He described arriving at the scene, seeing Sarah in the window, making the decision to go inside. He kept his testimony factual and brief, uncomfortable with being the focus of attention. But his words painted a vivid picture of the danger Sarah had been in and the narrow window of time that had existed for her rescue. The defense attorney tried to question whether the fire had really been that dangerous, whether Sarah couldn't have simply climbed down somehow. It was an insulting line of questioning that showed how desperate Marcus's lawyer was. James remained calm and explained in simple terms that Sarah would have died within minutes if he hadn't reached her. The fire had been accelerated by the gasoline. The smoke alone would have killed her. There was no other way out. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. They found Marcus Webb guilty on all counts, including attempted murder, arson, and stalking. The courtroom erupted in a mix of reactions. Sarah started crying, overwhelmed with relief and residual fear. Her family hugged her tightly. James sat quietly in his seat, satisfied that justice had been served but taking no pleasure in another person's downfall, even someone who had tried to commit murder. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Margaret Harrison, had a reputation for being tough on violent offenders. She listened to victim impact statements from Sarah and several members of Sarah's family. Sarah spoke about the nightmares, the fear, the loss of everything she owned. She talked about the physical pain of her injuries and the longer-lasting psychological trauma. She looked directly at Marcus as she spoke, refusing to let him see her fear. Marcus's family also spoke, pleading for leniency. His mother cried and talked about his difficult childhood. His brother mentioned mental health struggles. They weren't wrong that Marcus had faced challenges in his life, but Judge Harrison had heard these stories countless times. Difficult circumstances didn't excuse attempted murder. The judge sentenced Marcus Webb to 35 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. It was a stiff sentence that sent a clear message about the severity of his crime. Marcus showed no emotion as the sentence was read. He was led out of the courtroom in chains, his mother sobbing in the gallery. Sarah felt conflicted about the whole thing. Justice had been served, but it didn't erase what had happened. It didn't give her back her sense of safety or her lost possessions. It was closure, but not healing. After the trial, Sarah tried to return to her normal life. She had moved into a new apartment, smaller than her old one, but in a building with better security. She had installed extra locks and a security system. She was still jumpy and struggled with anxiety, but therapy was helping. Work remained challenging, but she was managing. James had made his decision about the military. He retired from active duty in January, exactly 12 years after enlisting. It was bittersweet leaving the Navy SEALs. The teams had been his family, his identity, his purpose. But he was ready for something different. He wanted a life that didn't involve constant deployments and combat. He wanted to put down roots somewhere. He decided to stay in Detroit. His sister was there, and she was the only family he had left. His parents had passed away years ago in a car accident. Rebecca had been his anchor during difficult times, and he wanted to be closer to her. There was also the fact that Sarah was in Detroit, though James tried not to think too much about that factor in his decision. Finding civilian work was easier than he expected. James's skills were highly valued. Security firms wanted to hire him. Law enforcement agencies reached out. But James surprised everyone, including himself, by taking a job as a high school counselor working with at-risk youth. He had to go back to school to get the proper certifications, but the military helped pay for his education. It seemed like an odd choice for a former Navy SEAL, but it made sense to James. He had spent his military career in high-stakes situations helping people in immediate danger. Now he wanted to help people before they reached crisis points. He wanted to intervene in young lives, help kids who were heading down bad paths, be the mentor he wished he had when he was younger. Sarah was surprised when James told her about his new career path. She had assumed he would go into security or law enforcement like most former special operations soldiers. But as he explained his thinking, she understood. It was actually very consistent with who James was. He ran toward people who needed help. In the military, that meant combat zones. In civilian life, that meant struggling teenagers. They continued to spend time together, though both were careful to maintain the boundaries of friendship. They met for coffee, went to movies, attended a cooking class together that was mostly them laughing at their terrible culinary skills. Their friendship deepened and became one of the most important relationships in both their lives. But neither of them acknowledged what was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone around them. Rebecca tried to talk to James about his feelings for Sarah. She had watched them together and could see what her brother refused to admit. James deflected, insisting they were just friends, that Sarah was recovering from trauma and didn't need romantic complications. Rebecca rolled her eyes at his stubbornness but didn't push. Her brother had always been headstrong. Sarah's sister had similar conversations with her. Emily could see how Sarah lit up when talking about James, how she checked her phone constantly hoping for his messages, how she carefully chose her outfits on days they were meeting. Emily gently suggested that maybe Sarah's feelings were more than gratitude. Sarah denied it at first, then admitted she might care about James but insisted the timing was wrong. She was still healing, still dealing with trauma. She didn't trust her own judgment about relationships right now. Spring came to Detroit, bringing warmer weather and the promise of renewal. Sarah had been working with her therapist for almost a year now. The nightmares were less frequent. She could be in closed spaces without panic. Loud noises still startled her, but she recovered faster. She was healing, slowly but surely. One Saturday in April, James invited Sarah to a charity event for veterans. It was a fundraiser dinner with an auction to support programs for former military members transitioning to civilian life. James was on the organizing committee and wanted Sarah there for moral support. She agreed immediately, happy to support a cause that was important to him. The event was held at a nice hotel downtown. Sarah wore a blue dress that made her feel confident and beautiful. Her burn scars were visible on her arms, but she had stopped trying to hide them. They were part of her story, part of her survival. James arrived to pick her up wearing a suit that made him look different from his usual casual style. More polished, more formal, but still unmistakably himself. The dinner was lovely. They sat at a table with other veterans and their families. The conversations were warm and genuine, full of shared experiences and mutual understanding. Sarah felt welcomed into this community of people who had served and sacrificed. They treated her with respect, thanking her for her own service as a social worker, acknowledging that helping people took many forms. During the auction, James bid on several items for charity. He won a weekend cabin rental and a signed football from the Detroit Lions. But it was the final auction item that changed everything. It was a painting donated by a local artist, a beautiful landscape of Lake Michigan at sunset. Sarah had mentioned once, months ago, that she loved that particular beach and had always wanted art featuring it. James bid aggressively, driving the price up far beyond what the painting was probably worth. Other bidders dropped out one by one until only James remained. He won the painting and immediately turned to Sarah, telling her it was hers. She was stunned, touched by his memory of a casual comment she had made so long ago. After the event, they walked through downtown Detroit. The night was warm and the city was alive with people enjoying the spring weather. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversation flowing easily as it always did. They ended up at the riverfront watching the lights reflect on the water. Sarah stopped walking and turned to face James. She had been thinking about this moment for months, preparing what she would say. But now that the moment was here, all her prepared words disappeared. Instead, she simply told him the truth. She had feelings for him. More than friendship. More than gratitude. She understood if he didn't feel the same way. Understood if the circumstances of how they met made things too complicated. But she needed him to know Jay. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm for James and Sarah. They bought a house together in a quiet Detroit neighborhood with good schools and friendly neighbors. It was a modest place with a small yard, but it felt like home in a way neither of them had experienced before. Sarah planted flowers in the garden. James built a workshop in the garage where he restored old furniture as a hobby. Their careers continued to flourish in unexpected ways. Sarah was promoted to supervisor at her agency, overseeing a team of social workers and implementing new safety protocols. She used her experience to create better systems for protecting caseworkers who faced threats. Her initiatives became a model that other agencies across Michigan started adopting. James found that working with teenagers gave him a sense of purpose he had been missing since leaving the military. He started a mentoring program at the high school that paired at-risk students with successful adults in the community. The program reduced dropout rates significantly. Local news covered the story, and James found himself once again in the spotlight. Though he remained characteristically humble about his achievements, one student in particular benefited from James's mentorship. David Johnson was a 15-year-old kid who had been in and out of trouble since middle school. His father was in prison. His mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. David was angry at the world and on a path that would likely lead to jail or worse. James saw something in David that reminded him of himself at that age. The anger masking pain, the tough exterior hiding vulnerability, the assumption that the world had already decided who he would be. James started meeting with David every week, not just talking but listening. He took David to the gym and taught him to channel his anger into physical exercise. He helped David with homework and college applications, even though David insisted college wasn't for people like him. Slowly, David changed. His grades improved. He stayed out of trouble. He started thinking about a future beyond his neighborhood. When David graduated high school with honors and a full scholarship to a state university, he credited James with saving his life. James deflected the praise, but Sarah knew how much it meant to him. He was making a difference in ways that mattered. 3 years into their marriage, Sarah and James decided to start a family. It was a decision they approached carefully, knowing that children would change everything. But they both wanted kids, wanted to create the kind of loving home neither of them had fully experienced growing up. Sarah got pregnant within a few months, and they were both thrilled and terrified. The pregnancy was difficult. Sarah had complications related to her old injuries. The smoke damage to her lungs made breathing harder as the baby grew. Her doctors monitored her closely, concerned about potential problems. James worried constantly, though he tried to hide it. The idea of losing Sarah after everything they had been through was unbearable. Their daughter Emma was born premature at 7 months. She was tiny, barely 5 pounds, and had to spend 3 weeks in the neonatal intensive care unit. Those were the longest 3 weeks of James and Sarah's lives. They took turns sitting with Emma, talking to her through the incubator, willing her to be strong. The nurses told them that premature babies could sense their parents' presence, that it helped them fight. Emma fought. She had her parents' stubbornness and determination. She gained weight steadily. Her lungs developed properly. After 22 days, the doctors said she could go home. James and Sarah cried with relief as they carried their daughter out of the hospital. Parenthood was everything people said it would be. Exhausting, overwhelming, and absolutely wonderful. Emma was a happy baby who rarely cried. She had James's dark eyes and Sarah's smile. Watching James with their daughter melted Sarah's heart in ways she hadn't anticipated. This man who had run through fire for her was now singing lullabies off-key and changing diapers with military precision. Sarah took maternity leave but found it hard to be away from work. She missed her colleagues and clients. She worried about the families she was supposed to be helping. But she also treasured this time with Emma, these early months that would never come again. It was a balance she struggled to find. James adjusted his schedule to be home more. He worked with his school to create a flexible arrangement that allowed him to be present for Emma while still mentoring his students. It wasn't always easy, but they made it work through communication and compromise and a willingness to ask for help when they needed it. Rebecca was a devoted aunt who babysat regularly. Sarah's parents visited often, thrilled to be grandparents. The community of friends they had built supported them through the challenging early months of parenthood. It reminded them both that they weren't alone, that they had people who cared about them and wanted to help. On Emma's first birthday, they threw a party in their backyard. Friends, family, colleagues, and some of James's former students attended. David Johnson came with his girlfriend, proudly telling everyone how James had changed his life. Some of Sarah's clients sent cards and small gifts, grateful for everything she had done for their families. As Sarah watched James playing with Emma in the grass, she thought about how far they had come. 5 years ago, she had been dying in a burning building. She had lost everything she owned. She had been broken and traumatized and unsure if she would ever feel safe again. Now she had a husband who loved her unconditionally. She had a beautiful daughter who was healthy and happy. She had a career she was passionate about. She had a home filled with laughter and warmth. The scars on her arms were still visible, would always be visible. But they no longer represented only pain. They represented survival. They represented the night that had changed her life in ways both terrible and miraculous. James looked up and caught her watching him. He smiled and waved, Emma babbling happily in his arms. Sarah smiled back, feeling a rush of love so intense it almost hurt. This was her family. This was her life. And it was good. The local news did a follow-up story on them 5 years after the fire. They usually avoided media attention, but they agreed to this interview because the reporter wanted to focus on recovery and resilience rather than just the dramatic rescue. They sat together on their couch, Emma playing nearby, and talked about moving forward after trauma. Sarah spoke about the importance of therapy and support systems. She emphasized that healing wasn't linear, that there were still hard days when the fear and anxiety crept back. But those days were outnumbered by good ones now. She had built a life she loved from the ashes of that terrible night. James talked about finding purpose after the military. He explained how helping kids had given him a new mission, a new way to serve. He emphasized that heroism wasn't just about dramatic rescues. It was about showing up every day for the people who needed you. It was about being present and committed and refusing to give up on people. The reporter asked if they ever thought about Marcus Webb. Sarah admitted she did occasionally. She knew he was in prison and would be for many more years. She hoped he was getting help, getting treatment for whatever had led him to such violence. She didn't forgive him for what he did, but she didn't spend her energy hating him either. Hatred was exhausting, and she had better things to do with her life. After the interview aired, they received hundreds of messages from people inspired by their story. Burn survivors reached out, thanking them for talking openly about recovery. Veterans transitioning to civilian life asked James for advice. Social workers shared their own stories of facing threats and continuing to serve. James and Sarah realized they had a platform they could use for good. They started speaking at events about trauma recovery, about finding purpose after crisis, about the importance of helping professions. They became advocates for better support systems for both victims of violence and the professionals who served them. But mostly, they lived their lives. They raised Emma and welcomed a son, Michael, 2 years later. They celebrated anniversaries and birthdays. They supported each other through career challenges and family health issues. They were there for Rebecca when she went through a difficult divorce. They helped David Johnson with his wedding planning when he got married. They were ordinary people who had experienced something extraordinary. But they didn't let that night define them. It was part of their story, an important chapter, but not the whole book. They were writing new chapters every day, filling them with love and laughter and purpose. 10 years after the fire, Sarah and James went back to Maple Street. The building had been renovated after the fire, but it looked mostly the same. They stood on the sidewalk looking up at the third-floor window where Sarah had hung, where James had jumped. It felt like a lifetime ago and like yesterday all at once. A young couple came out of the building carrying groceries. They were laughing about something, completely unaware of the history of the place they called home. Sarah and James watched them go, touched by how life continued, how spaces that had held trauma could become homes again. They held hands as they walked back to their car. Neither of them said much. There wasn't much that needed to be said. They had survived. They had healed. They had built something beautiful from the worst night of their lives. That was enough. That was everything.